1 out of every 3 ancestral signatures in this DNA doesn't match anything in Africa. Not because the test failed, because the population it came from doesn't exist anymore. That's what researchers found when they sequenced maternal DNA from the Gullah Geechee, a community living on a chain of islands off South Carolina and Georgia. They ran it against every African reference database available. A meaningful share of the lineages came back with no match at all. Not blurry, not partial. Absent. Whole ancestral communities that once existed on the West African coast, gone so completely that modern science has no population left to compare them to. For over a century, the accepted explanation for the Gullah Geechee was simple. Isolated by geography, protected by disease, they held onto more of their African inheritance than almost anyone else in the country. Language, foodways, farming knowledge passed down largely intact. That explanation isn't wrong, but it was never the whole file. Because while historians were reading the culture, geneticists were quietly building something else, one of the largest, cleanest genetic datasets of African ancestry in North America. And for decades, almost nobody outside a handful of research institutions knew how much that dataset was being used. Since the early 2000s, Gullah Geechee blood samples have shown up again and again in lupus research, hypertension studies, kidney disease consortia. Not by accident. Researchers chose this population specifically because their genetic isolation made them unusually easy to study. Less mixing, cleaner signal, better data. Study after study drew on Gullah samples for that reason, feeding papers that rarely circled back to the people who supplied them. The community provided the material. The institutions produced the papers. It took until 2021 for a Gullah chiefess to insist on being named as a co-author on one of those studies, not as a courtesy, but because until then, that hadn't been the norm. Nobody had asked the islands what they wanted done with what was drawn from them. So before we even get to where this DNA came from, there's a simpler question sitting underneath the whole case. Whose record is this, and who decided how it would be used? Hold that, because the unmatched signatures are about to get stranger. To understand why a third of these maternal lines have no African match, you have to go back to how this population was assembled in the first place. Rice. Specifically, the tidal rice cultivation techniques of the West African coast, knowledge that Carolina and Georgia planters didn't have and desperately needed. Ships were sent to specific ports, Sierra Leone chief among them, to bring back people who already knew how to flood a field on a tide table. That's the part of the story most documentaries stop at. Sierra Leone, rice, isolation, done. But when geneticists ran full genome comparisons, not just Sierra Leone, but 16 distinct West African reference populations, the picture didn't hold together as neatly. Gullah ancestry showed a slightly closer relationship to Sierra Leone than the broader African American population does. Slightly, not exclusively. The same DNA showed comparable ties to populations from Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and West Central Africa, including regions near the Congo and Angola. The culture pointed at one place. The genome pointed at many. Then came the burial ground. In Charleston, construction crews uncovered dozens of sets of 18th century remains, later confirmed as people of African descent, buried without names or markers beneath what had become a parking lot. Researchers extracted ancient DNA directly from the bone, genetic material old enough to predate the centuries of mixing that blur modern ancestry results. What they found wasn't one population. It was several, side by side in the same burial ground. Some individuals traced closer to West Central Africa, others to the windward coast. One showed lineage tied to communities near the Gambia. People buried within feet of each other, sometimes more genetically distant from one another than either was from populations in 3 separate countries today. That's the mosaic behind the unmatched third. Some of those maternal lines don't fail to match Sierra Leone because the researchers got the region wrong. They fail to match anything, anywhere, because the specific communities they came from were dismantled so thoroughly by the slave trade that no reference population survives to compare them to. The gap in the database isn't a technical failure. It's a measurement of erasure, written in absence instead of evidence. The same genome carries a second pattern researchers described carefully. European ancestry in Gullah Geechee DNA arrived almost entirely through the paternal line, while the maternal lines this case depends on stayed overwhelmingly African. Researchers have been direct about what that split reflects: the power imbalance of plantation life, not romance or choice. Even the shape of the admixture is evidence, which brings the case to its second twist. In 2025, researchers at Howard University compared Gullah Geechee maternal lineages not just to West African populations, but to African American populations across the entire country. The haplogroup patterns lined up closely. European and Native American maternal markers, common elsewhere in African American DNA due to centuries of forced mixing, showed up at a much lower rate in Gullah samples. From that, researchers floated a proposal the field is still arguing about: that Gullah Geechee maternal lineages may represent something closer to a founding population for African Americans broadly, not a regional variant of it, but closer to a source. The theory ties to the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans left the rural South for cities across the country, carrying their ancestry into new populations that mixed further with each generation. The people who stayed on the islands, protected by the same isolation that once made them a research target, may have kept something closer to the original signal. Nobody has confirmed that claim. It isn't settled science. But if even part of it holds, it means the answer to the unmatched third isn't only about the past. It's a live question about where a large share of Black American ancestry traces back to, sitting unresolved in an active research debate right now, which makes the next fact considerably harder to sit with. The land that makes this genetic isolation possible is disappearing. Coastal development has already reduced Gullah Geechee landholding dramatically since its post-Civil War peak, largely through property law technicalities rather than direct sale. Projected sea level rise puts parts of these islands underwater within a few decades. There's a federally designated Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, 400 miles of coastline, a website, a commission. None of it comes with a legal mechanism to stop a single acre from being sold at a tax auction or lost outright to flooding. So here's where the case stands. A third of the maternal lineages in this population don't match any known African community, because those communities were erased before anyone could record them. The lineages that do match suggest ties not to one homeland, but to several, layered by generations of forced mixing and, in one Charleston burial ground, snapshotted in people who lived close enough to the original rupture to still carry it distinctly. Researchers are now asking whether this same population might sit at the root of a much larger share of Black American ancestry than anyone assumed, and the physical place that made all of it possible to trace. The isolation that kept the signal intact for 300 years is running out of time on a schedule nobody in that research is tracking. The DNA has outlasted the ships, the plantations, the burial records, and 2 centuries of deliberate attempts to erase where these people came from. What it hasn't outlasted yet is property law and a rising tide. Nobody has modeled what happens to this record if the land goes first, what gets lost from the unmatched third before anyone finishes matching it. What happens to a founding population theory if the population it depends on can no longer be sampled? That analysis doesn't exist yet. The question is just sitting there, unanswered, while the clock the researchers aren't watching keeps running under the water table.